Good morning, everybody. Good morning here from Wellington, or good morning, good evening, good afternoon to the rest of the world, because this seminar has gone live to across the world. So we've got people from all over the place. Today's speaker is an ex-PhD student from Victoria University, and to all of us, we just know her as Heike. So Heike was a PhD student here under Professors Doug Pearce and Professor Karen Smith. And many years ago, we were talking about this last night. That PhD was on family tourism. But since finishing at VUW, Heike went up to Auckland to AUT, and where she's been a really big success story, continuing her research on family tourism, but also branching out into other areas within tourism research, fundamentally on gender research. In today's presentation, what we are not talking about, masculinities in the field of research and tourism, is an extension of her previous book on femininity in tourism. So welcome, and there's the book. So welcome, Heike. So without any further ado, I'd just like to hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Ian, and good morning, everyone. And yes, I hear there's others watching us and listening to us on the webinar online. So it's a real pleasure being back in Wellington. As Ian mentioned, I actually graduated 11 years ago. And I've been now at AET for almost 10 years. Karen, believe it or not. I know, where did that time go? So I was at Victoria University, I think, for 12 years overall. So now I'm an associate professor at AET, but I really need to acknowledge my collaborators. And the initial book, the Femininities in the Field book, Associate Professor Brooke Porter, who lives in Italy. And that really got us starting, which then led to, which led us then to our follow-up book on masculinities in the field. Tourism and Transdisciplinary Research, which I want to talk about today, but I also will talk a little bit about the femininities in the field. And you might ask, what is a woman talking about masculinities? And that's probably a good question, but I've just sort of explained myself. We started off with the femininities book, and then we felt very strongly that actually we need a book on masculinities as well. And for this, we invited my good friend and colleague, Professor Joseph Chia, who is at Waka University in Japan. And he really gave us the extra insight and kudos as well. Right, yeah, that's better. Okay, great. Hopefully technology is sorted. So what about gender issues in general? A really good book I've very much enjoyed about Caroline Criado Perez in her book Invisible Women, Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men, states that there are three main themes that crop up again and again for women. It's the female body, women's unpaid care burden, and male violence against women. These are issues of such significance that they touch on nearly every area of women's lives, including conducting research in the field and working as an academic. The same is not true for men, because men do not have female bodies or often the same care responsibilities. And while men may have to contend with harassment, this violence typically manifests in quite a different way from violence faced by men. We also need to acknowledge in a Western academic context that gender is thought of as being socially constructed. Okay. Overall, the differences in fieldwork experiences for women and men have been largely ignored. And academia has proceeded as if the male body and its attendant life experience are the gender-neutral default. It is only through more reflective exercises that the gendered nature of fieldwork and research is beginning to emerge. And this is, of course, where our book compilations on femininities and masculinities in the field come in. The consensus is that field space remains a masculine construct. And there's the idea of gendered privilege accompanying masculinity in masculine spaces. The underlying sentiment here is that this is still very much a men's world and in need of more reflective practices. Which really leads me to talk about our first book on femininities in the field, which was published in 2018. It started out with women's field experiences in What Are We Not Talking About? It was about the influential experiences in the field, deliberately omitted by women, not only from their doctoral theses, but also from the academic tourism literature. Many women reported that this was the most cathartic and rewarding writing they have ever done as an academic, such as reflecting on taking their baby to the field, for example, to the Arctic. And this is what Susan Froelich had to say about her reflection on bringing her baby to Everest Base Camp when conducting research. She published this amazing paper in 2002. It is about the embodied entanglements that play out between ourselves or subjectivities and our research sites, both before and while we are in the field. And it is about something we as academics do not talk about. Soon after finishing this book compilation, it became obvious that the need for more masculine perspectives on field work was also pressing. Despite some criticism, our original aims remain unchanged. Our call for equality is in recognizing that gender issues in field work are deserving of our attention. In doing so, we acknowledge that viewing the field as a masculine space is defunct. What about gender in tourism research? Traditionally, tourism research has been gender blind, and most studies in tourism make no mention of any gender considerations. It's only really in more recent years that research into gender have almost exclusively come from female researchers and from a feminist lens. As a result, gender studies have consistently failed to excite the imagination of media, the general public, or the wider social science academy, because gender is still equated with studies of women's experiences. We do have to acknowledge that there is increasing gender diversity, and seeing gender as a spectrum and non-binary is still lacking. Maybe one day we break free from binary conceptualizations of male and female. Well, we can dream, isn't it? But there's still a long way to go until then. Masculinities in tourism research is also lacking, including studies on fatherhood. So my background, as Ian mentioned at the beginning, is family research and tourism. And to my knowledge, I'm still just about the only one researching fatherhood in tourism. Why, you might ask? I wish I had an answer. So you might ask, what about masculinity studies? Have you even heard of masculinity studies? Let me tell you a little bit more about that. Masculinities in plural acknowledges that there is more than one way to be a man. At a deeper level, it has long been argued that masculinities are multifarious in conception, with untold complexities and contradictions, in that invocations of masculinities as straightforward and simplistic are counterproductive to fostering optimum gender relations. Masculinities as a field of study continues to lag behind research on femininities. Some progress is being made as reflected in the Center for the Study of Men and Masculinities at Stony Brook University, part of the State University of New York system, which began offering a master's degree in masculinity studies in 2019. This means that masculinity studies at a postgraduate level have only been in existence for 2 years. So you can see we've still got a very long way to go. Masculinity studies is described as offering a framework to break down so-called toxic masculinity, seen as affecting people of all genders. There's also increasing public debate about masculinities, including in New Zealand, such as the He'll Be Right Masculinity podcast that was published by stuff.co.nz, which are about the search of the right way to be a man in 2021 and reflect on modern masculinities in Aotearoa. However, this reflexivity is still missing in debates in tourism research. For decades now, female writers and theorists have been dismantling their biological gender from the perceived feminine roles that can restrict or harm their lives. But it's only recently that we have started to do this with men too, to see a man as distinct from the concept of and construct of masculinity. And this is what our book set out to do. And that really leads me to the book, and there's a copy there as well. So this was published, it actually came out this year, Masculinities in the Field. Our book compilation on masculinities in the field, for which we invited my colleague, and friend Joseph Chia to contribute and give us some kind of authority. After all, we were women entering the field of masculinities and needed an authentic male voice. So what are we not talking about? The reflective accounts of gendered field experiences exploring the question of what it means to be a man. Masculinity is fundamentally defined as the quality of being male. While this is simplistic, the purpose of this book compilation was not to challenge the construction and/or deconstruction of masculinity. Instead, our aim was to create a space where the performances of masculinities in academia field spaces can be explored. We set out to establish how the performance of masculinities plays out in the field by asking researchers, all of whom are male, 14 in total contributing, how gender has influenced and shaped their research practice. We recruited our contributors through convenient sampling, mainly by tapping male scholars we knew on their shoulder. It was about advancing the attention of gender and white bias in fieldwork, this time through a masculine lens and showcasing why the wider academy must embrace masculinities training, as it were. The 14 contributors were self-defined, self-reflexive, using first-person accounts describing the constructs of varying masculinities and the sometimes fluid and contextual performance of masculinities. Reflections on masculinities were coming in many personal forms and were organized in 4 parts. Part 1, hegemonic and heteronormative masculinities, looks at what it means to be a manly man. Part 2, performing heteronormative masculinities. The contributors reflect on gender and sexuality and their influence on fieldwork and gendered performance. Part 3, situated masculinities, explores the intersections of gender, ethnicities, and cross-cultural experiences. Part 4, paternal masculinities, reflects on accompanied fieldwork as a father researcher and explores the intricacies of fatherhood in field research. Interestingly, we had difficulties to find contributors to reflect on their fatherhood and field research. I will illustrate the 4 parts with a contributor's reflection each and by letting the contributors speak for themselves. It is interesting to note that whereas none of the female contributors in our femininities book questioned their femininity, all the men in this book question to some extent what it means to be a man today and seemingly distance themselves from being part of the emergent toxic masculinities. And that's very much a theme that goes throughout this book. So I start off with an example with a book chapter by Shepard, who wrote about It's Okay to Cry, encouraging emotional writing among male tourism scholars. And this is part of the hegemonic and heteronormative masculinities. And this is what Jack had to say. What we are saying to a boy when we tell him to man up or act like a man, at its most benign, we might be saying, do the things that needs doing, even if you don't want to do it. But more often, when we tell a boy to act like a man, we're effectively saying, stop expressing those feelings. And if the boy hears that often enough, it actually starts to sound uncannily like, stop feeling those feelings. As boys grow up, so does their masculinity. It becomes stricter, its expectations heavier. It is okay to bumble your way through masculinity as a boy, but not as a man. As a man, you have to start perfecting the art of what it means to be masculine. A masculinity that teaches boys and men not to talk about emotions. Boys don't cry. As a result, it's not so much act your age, but act your gender. Jack highlights how the supremacy of obstinacy and the rejection of emotion as key cornerstones of Western masculinity entrench themselves in manhood. He reflects on the way we produce knowledge. The masculine approach to tourism studies derided by scholars as positivistic, objective, and emotionless. This is about the primacy of masculinity in our academy, maintaining a facade of objectivity, pretending that the researcher can enter the field as an emotionless, detached observer. It is about the way tourism studies show a disregard for emotional writings and how Western epistemology view the placing of emotion and reason as incompatible. This neglects that emotions are integral to our understanding of the world. And after all, tourism is an emotional experience, right? By rejecting emotions in research, we also dehumanize those we study, sorry. So how to bring emotions back into our scholarship? How to bring humanity and its emotions and sensibilities closer to the center of what we do as a researcher? And these were questions we also posed for our Femininities book. Jack used autoethnography as a method by using personal stories to explore societal issues. This is about putting reflexivity and emotion central to our understanding of culture. Autoethnography is still in its infancy within tourism, with men not taking the reflexive driving seat. It can encourage us to embrace and reveal the multiple selves that we bring with us into the field in allowing the cacophony of voices. Jack reflected on his subjective experiences of tourism within contested spaces in Bethlehem and Palestine. In doing so, he unleashed the Pandora's box of the epistemology of emotion that men had self-consciously kept shut. As such, in this chapter, Jack's reflection is about going deeper using autoethnography and encouraging emotional and more truthful writing among male scholars. I now want to move on to the next part, performing heteronormative masculinities. And this contribution is based on Richard Aquino's reflection on his performance of Filipino masculinity in the field and how his performed masculinity affected his interaction with research participants. Richard is Filipino. He was my master and my PhD student, but has been living in New Zealand for several years as an openly gay man. However, going back to the Philippines and conducting research in rural communities required him to go back into the closet. This is his reflection on his identity and sense of masculinity and about packaging his masculine self to fit with more traditional Filipino masculinity. Like many colonized territories, Western colonialism has distorted traditional gender roles and ideologies in the Philippines. Pre-colonial societies in the Philippines had enjoyed sexually egalitarian social structures. Yet the introduction of Roman Catholicism through Spanish colonialization has embedded misogyny and patriarchy in native Philippine cultures, with consequent changes to gender roles and relations in the country. Today, Filipino society is largely considered patriarchal, with traditional views on gender roles implying that men should convey a strong character and image in society. As a result, men not conforming to this hegemonic Filipino masculinity are labeled as gay, with homosexuality not being widely accepted. Richard's community-based research approach required his immersion in the field. This required the negotiation of his gender and sexuality to fit the standards of traditional Filipino masculinity. His main priority was to prepare for the practicalities of conducting field research. So packing for his gender performance is not explicitly linked with the latter. He acknowledges that while in the field, he must keep his masculinity in place to be respected and to establish his credibility as a researcher. Having this agenda in mind means packaging himself to conform to the hegemonic image of a Filipino male through his clothing, language, actions, and interactions with others. His main concern became acting approximately masculine to try and fit in. This performance required participating in drinking culture, accepting boys' comments and jokes, and conforming to other masculine behavior. He also experienced performance anxiety when encountering sexist masculine jokes and stigmatizing homosexual comments, or when he felt that he was not conforming well to the local masculine image. Richard speaks of having to wear a mask when he is in the field to establish rapport and form professional relationships with his research participants without deceiving them, at least until homosexuality is more accepted in the Philippines. So in a sense, performing heteronormative masculinities for non-heterosexual male researchers is then strongly configured in relation to their experienced struggles for acceptance and normalization, and something we do not talk about. We managed to include 2 contributors reflecting on this performance in the book. Now moving to part 3, situated masculinities. And this contribution is by my co-editor and good colleague and friend, Joseph Chia. So he reflects about his performance of masculinity in field research and how he is negotiated and shaped by cross-cultural context. This is central to much fieldwork, especially in cross-cultural contexts where patriarchal structures underline extant societies. This reflection grapples with Mutua's assertion that in invoking masculinities in research, we are compelled to develop frameworks that more fully capture the complexities of men's lives. For male researchers, cross-cultural contexts that challenge normative understandings of masculinity and maleness, and especially the appropriate placement of women in society, can be confronting, discomforting, and alien. This is particularly the case when our notions of masculinity are a departure from the encountered in the field. Negotiating dissonance between fieldworker attitudes towards masculinities and the superstructures around what it means to be a man, alongside contrasting notions evident in cross-cultural fieldwork encounters, sow the seeds for a range of emotions, including bewilderment, discontent, apprehension, and abhorrence, among others. This tends to occur when in situ masculinities are severely at odds with what researchers are usually accustomed to. For Joseph, it is evident that the upshot of a mixed race and multicultural background has had a profound influence on his construction of self and the attitudes and perspectives attached to it. His research perspective, steeped in the Asia-Pacific, while maintaining Pan-Asian and Eurasian identities, gives him both etic and emic perspectives, or inside-outside perspectives, for his research in Vanuatu. Joseph was quickly embraced by many of the participants of his research on account of his Pacific heritage, privileged by belonging to a Pacific brotherhood, and defined in opposition to the fact that he was not a Bislama, or white man of European descent. In Vanuatu, the performance of masculinity is largely representative of masculinities in Melanesian contexts more generally, where an abiding dominance of the patriarchy in indigenous institutions persists. During fieldwork, the gender position he encountered privileged male authority, where women, also valued for their contributions to public and private life, dominate the keeping of the domestic domain. This meant that also he sought a more representative sample of community attitudes, ingrained sociality subordinated potential female participants, meaning that most participants in his fieldwork were men. This made the space he inhabited an overwhelmingly male domain. So how to deal with this as a self-defined social progressive? How can the voices of women be amplified in the pursuit of sustainable development of tourism? These are all practical constraints that all researchers face in situations where the in situ culture is much different to what we are accustomed to. However, when male researchers are expected to conform to the local and patriarchal context, challenging these norms can be risky. Herein was the dilemma he faced in the demonstration of his masculinity. Should he go along with the structures in place, or to try to bend them toward what he saw was most acceptable? Instead, he downplayed his own socially constructed normative understandings to abide by what was customary at the field study site. Also, he encountered mild moral anxiety, given that as a socially progressive male, he sees the merits in addressing the impacts of patriarchal dominance. This is what Joseph had to say about situated masculinities. For researchers, and in particular male researchers coming into the country with very different conceptualizations of gender discourses, the practice of individual masculinities in the field needs to be given greater importance in fieldwork planning and preparation. Very often, foreign male researchers enter Vanuatu confronted with having little understanding of the country's cultural norms, while also disadvantaged by their lack of adeptness in the local language. Male researchers would do well to examine and understand the ways pre-existing masculinities are conceived of and applied at each of the study sites they work in, especially if they're diametrically opposed to their own. This now leads me to part 4, the last part, paternal masculinities. Stuart Reid reflected on the masculine entanglements of family in field and field in family in his chapter. Traditionally, the personal and professional entanglements of family and field are mainly from female points of view. This was the case for our Femininities book, where I, for example, reflected on my accompanied research with my 2 daughters in tow when doing field work in Samoa on family tourism. Having children with me gave me instant access and a level of trust when recruiting other families. However, when it came to reflections on paternal masculinities, we had difficulties finding male researchers who are fathers to reflect on their accompanied research experiences. I met Stuart at a conference in Finland in 2018. Stuart, and he's a middle-aged man, so he did his PhD at a later stage. Stuart is originally from Australia, but he decided to move his family of 3 children and wife to Sweden for his PhD research. Stuart's reflection is about solving the personal-professional dilemma by bringing his family with him to the field and setting the stage for accompanied fieldwork in Sweden. This is what Stuart had to say. As a heterosexual married man who is a father to 3 young children, I occupy family roles as husband and father, and these circumstantial positions variously activate masculinities of fatherhood and husbandhood in all the domains of social life, including when I'm a researcher in the field. Chief among his concern was his perceived masculine duty as husband and father to keep his family happy and safe. It became apparent for him that family care and homemaking burdens of field relocation work are both uneven and gendered, privileging the one who is the researcher at the expense of the one who is not, and likely more so when this happens to be a male. He acknowledged that most of this work was done by his wife. He also reflected that not only did each instance of family distress render the culture shock cost of accompanied fieldwork apparent, but also signal a personal failure to protect his family from harm. However, on the plus side, when taking his children along on field research, his children became incidental adjuncts to his research enterprise through their active involvement in these spaces. Also, some of the disruptions of family afforded many new insights into his research, such as having to take his son to the toilet, which allowed him insights into the backstage of his field site. Additionally, his husband fatherhood afforded entry points for discussions, just as for women. Accompanied research involving families can be a resource facilitating fieldwork, enabling interactions and revealing aspects of the field that might otherwise remain obscure. As a result, his masculinities of fatherhood and husbandhood became part of his research. His conclusion was that for researchers who have families, the masculinities arising in the intersection of family and field are always essentially present, and that family influences in the field, which has been acknowledged by women, are still rare by men. As I mentioned before, we managed to have 2 contributors in our book reflecting on their paternal masculinities. In conclusions, there are questions about what it means to be a man, which is continually being reshaped amid the ongoing resetting of gender relations. Research into gender is almost exclusively from female researchers, and much of this is focused on the quest for equality, empowerment, and inclusiveness in tourism. However, integrating considerations of gender into research practice should be imperative. Yet for many contributors, thinking about gender and the application of their masculinities was unprecedented. Furthermore, that the maleness of contributors could influence their research practice and somehow potentially shape their fieldwork outcomes was rarely acknowledged, if at all. Consider in fieldwork planning and research design phases. This highlights a rethink of how masculinities are conceived of and acted out in academic practice, and provides a sense that a narrow definition of masculinity is not serving anyone, be it in academia or in the public. It also questions the sense that hegemonic masculinities are not needing consideration or reflections, Instead, scholarship on masculinities can make a difference in fostering a shared sense towards a more inclusive humanity, and this should be something we should all strive towards. We finished off our book with emergent inquiries. We couldn't really give you answers, but we do have several questions, and I can't necessarily give you answers on these ones either. What does it mean to be a man? That was really the pervasive theme throughout the book. This is the overarching theme emerging from our contributors and is related to the all-consuming effort to proving to be a man anywhere in the world, which in fact can seem a ridiculous and anachronistic concept. Women would never entertain the concept of proving that they are a woman. Definitely never arose in our Femininities book. For female researchers, the struggles were largely in the world around them, while for male researchers, the struggles were often from the inside. Why does this matter? Because it gets us to the heart of the gender issue, in that identifying the diverse types of manliness can help us understand areas of concern and ways forward beyond the need for having to define what it means to be a man and the need for any proof. Why the resistance to emotional entanglements? For the most part, authors reflected a combination of ambivalence and uncertainty when it came to emotional entanglements, and these eventually presented as resistance. However, that generally heterosexual men shy away from emotional entanglement might be changing due to a shift in generational attitudes. We are seeing increasing debates about gender diversity in today's society, so why not in academia? Why are masculinities still taken for granted? How is the dominance of masculinity shaping research insights and knowledge production processes? How is access to research sites and participants gendered? Several contributors lamented that by virtue of being male, their access to certain research sites and contexts was constrained. But where do we draw the line in allowing males access to women-only safe spaces? Should they have access? Should we all have access to different spaces? How do we include a spectrum of masculinities? In relation to vulnerable masculinities, the experiences and challenges of non-heteronormative contributors and those from ethnically diverse backgrounds in this volume is testament that developing competencies to successfully negotiate particular masculinities is vital. How do we address toxic masculinities? How should we include the consideration of masculinities in research practice? One way would be to actively and immediately consider adding a gender dimension to research training, reflecting on both femininities and masculinities to expand and deepen tourism research with a truer gender perspective. In the end, our learnings and insights are not about gender itself, but that we all possess the same humanity, that we are one, which requires constant deep reflection to counter any possible imbalances due to gender, ethnicity, or otherwise. So I thank you for listening, and I'm of course more than happy to answer your questions, but I also would like to remind you that I only presented some of the voices of our 14 male contributors and that I cannot speak for them, because this is after all their book and I was only really an editor. And I also would like to mention, if you would like to buy the book, we've actually got a 40% discount that applies until the end of July, and the code is, it's not very well to see, MITF 40, or you can actually contact me for details. So thank you for listening, and I'm sure you've got lots of questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So to our audience online, if you put your questions into the Q&A session, if you want to ask any questions, we'll be able to pick them up. But I'm just wondering if there's anybody here would like to start the ball rolling. Any questions or emerging issues you'd like to ask? Doug. Sorry, can I just ask you to walk into the...
I should have seen stay here for me.
Just to comment on the titles of your two books and one of the points you raise in your emergent queries. Your titles are Femininities and Masculinities in the Field. As a geographer, I would argue that there are many different sorts of field.
Yeah.
And by putting field into the plural, you would gain much greater insight into some of these issues.
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah. Yep. We had initially, I think, field research. So then it became, yeah, no, that's a good point. Yep. Thank you.
But I think you're guilty at the moment of putting the emphasis on the plurals on one side, but not on the other.
Yes, no, that's a good point. Thank you. Yeah. Yep.
Could you also say...
Thanks for not throwing it, Doug.
For the matter of record, Karen, could you just also introduce yourself? Just say who you are.
In a past time, Heike supervisor, but now very proud colleague. Heike, thank you for sharing. It was really interesting. I got a little bit distracted during the seminar by flicking through the copy that you'd placed in front of us. And one of the things I was really interested in, I just happened to open a couple of pages, and it happened to be where those writers were reflecting on this, was around the sort of profile of your respondents in terms of their seniority. And it was interesting you shared an example, say, from Richard about his PhD research, but you also have more senior academics in here as well. And I wondered if you kind of had any reflections on, or they had reflections on their seniority in relation to the topic.
Yeah, so we've got one chapter from Neil Carr, Professor Neil Carr, and he very much actually reflected on his whole, yeah, exactly. He reflected very much on his own journey. Yeah, so we had some PhD students, but we also had some senior. So probably Neil Carr's chapter and his whole journey and how he came about, and also actually very much about not being toxic masculine or heteronormative masculinity. And we also had Professor Mark Orange, and he admittedly, he really struggled writing that that chapter. He had to go 3 goes, I think, but he persevered. And admittedly, he never reflected on his masculinity. So that was actually really interesting. But we deliberately, and we very much shoulder tapped. So it was never an open call, who we knew, because it was difficult. I think we wouldn't have managed with an open call. I don't think people would have responded. So some were cornered, some were quite happy to participate. Some took forever to finish their chapters, but yeah.
Do you feel that those who are perhaps more senior were able to reflect more openly about this, or had they created an identity that they potentially were now challenging in a more public space? Well,
Neil Carr was quite okay because I think he works in these fields, but Mark Oren struggled. And I think that's where sort of a generation difference as well. The younger generation is much more, we have so many more debates about gender full stop in society. There's the younger generation, that's the whole non-binary and so on. So I think there's definitely a difference. So I think if I would go to some senior academics and ask them to reflect, I think depending on what kind of research they've done in the past, they probably would struggle much more than maybe current PhD students. So yeah.
I certainly like that you had got a cross section of but ages, but also careers as well. And that's right.
Yeah, we tried to get geographic as well. Look, it was quite difficult in the end to get contributors. Like I said, we managed to actually in the end get 2 fathers to reflect, but that was sort of difficult. Luckily, I met Stuart at a conference. So it's sometimes these incidental, how you meet people. But yeah, so we had 2 sort of from an African context, because that's the thing, it's sort of geographical. We have to be careful as well, because so much in academia is from an English-speaking perspective. So we actually had some from French Canada. So that was some really good contributors as well. So that's sort of another thing we have to be aware of. What are we talking about? What kind of masculinities? Are they all, English-speaking ones, or are they actually wider? I mean, in many ways, I think the way we look at it, this opens the debate, really, and more needs to be done. And hopefully it keeps rolling, and there will be other publications maybe from it as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Heike. We've got a couple of questions online. And the first question is from Lisa Raymond, who's a PhD student here. And her question is, did any of your participants reflect on field research conducted in New Zealand? And she'd be curious to hear about their experiences.
Partly. Probably Mark Orams, partly. Did who else? God, now I have to have a look as well. We had some New Zealand contributors. I mean, Richard went overseas, so let me have a quick look. No, I think everyone else was actually not in New Zealand. Nope.
No.
Yes, only partly Mark Orams, I think. So yeah.
So we have a second question from Kevin Wallace, and congratulate you on the book.
Thank you.
It looks excellent in the terms of a lot of field research. And the question from Kevin is, did any contributors reflect on other methodologies and the potential gender framing and the dynamics involved?
Other than autoethnography?
Yes.
Some did ethnography, but it's all related around that, autoethnography, or actually reflecting afterwards, after they've been doing research. I mean, Richards, he did grounded theory. So his was just a reflection as part of a PhD. So not everyone did autoethnography. I think some framed it around that whole idea. Now I'm looking back on what I've done, the research I've did, and if I would take an autoethnographic lens retrospectively, what would it look like?
And I've got a third question from online as well, from Danian Chen, who asks the question, thank you for a wonderful presentation. The speaker mentioned that gender is performative. In your opinion, which factors will influence this gendered performance?
Oof, where to open the door? Which, yeah, I don't think I can answer that, because there's all sorts of literature about the whole performance on masculinities, and that's where sort of Richard Akina talked about a mask. If you look at the Australian author Beto, he does research on families and fatherhood, and he actually says all men wear masks. So I think this is something much wider than I could probably answer here, and I think that's part of actually reflecting on that, whether we're all performing. I'm performing at the moment. I'm trying to be a woman and be an academic and be taken serious. So I don't know. So it's part of that. And I think by reflecting on that one, going into the field as well, are we, and Ken Seng actually reflected on that one, being the academic, but actually also being a gay man. So that's sort of sometimes these overlaps. Do we have different masks? Do we have different performances? So.
I'll ask a question, if that's okay. If you were to do volume 2, the second edition of this book, what would probably be in it in the second edition? What would probably, how would you probably change it?
Well, ideally it would be a third edition. I actually would like to see gender diversity, just get away of binaries, not masculinity or femininities, but actually, gender diversity, and be much more, get away from that binary thinking, really. Yeah. That would be my dream, but I think we've still got a long way to go for that one. So.
In line with that, I've got a question. So in relatively recent research, we've seen a stronger focus on feminist research paradigms and interpreting collection data through a feminist lens, which, on the one hand is lovely, but do we also need a masculine lens, or would that actually be a step back and we need a gender diverse, non-binary lens? What are your thoughts on that?
Probably it's a very good question. I mean, I do a lot of reviewing, and I've looked into this before. When you put in gender in tourism, you will invariably, everything that comes up is from a female perspective. And I get a little bit annoyed by that as well, because I don't think you can do that. I think then at least say it's female gender, to make it clearer, because we need to get away from that idea gender is automatically all women's experiences. And I made a point about that one as well. So I always actually felt very strongly, and that was sort of this family tourism research as well, as Karen and Doug would know. I did a whole family research because I was very adamant that I wanted to include everyone, including fathers, and that still hasn't been done. My feeling is really we need to branch out and need to go much broader, and maybe we actually need to go into gender diversity. Some would say we've always had a masculine lens, if you go back to a lot of research, because, in the 80s and 90s, you read any research papers and it says the tourist, he. It's always equated, it's always assumed, it was always made by default. So we have to be careful in that sense as well. But I think it's more what I've spoke about, particularly Shepard, in others, it's including different voices of masculinities, more emotions, different autoethnography. Again, in his chapter, he did a bit of research, and most autoethnography is actually being conducted by women, or if there are male authors, it's quite often the supervisors of female students. So, and I think that really needs to change, where we need to get away from thinking only objective research counts, but actually have much more wider and different ways of conducting research and having reflective sections. I think going forward, I get all my research students to at least have some reflective sections in their master's theses or PhDs. It's a step towards that, but also thinking about different ways we conduct research as well.
Okay. Any questions from anybody else?
I've got a fourth one popped up.
I have. It's actually a question to Doug Pearce. It's actually a question to Doug Pearce. So, it's a question from one of our master students, Amelia. And she'd like to know, when is the second edition of your book, Frameworks of Tourism Research, due?
It's not on the program at the moment, but if there was sufficient interest, I guess we could revive it.
Okay.
I think this is evidence of international interest, Doug.
I've got a question. Sorry, and Amelia says, ha, ha. I've got a question for you. If you finish the book, you've done the two books. If you had a potential PhD came to see you, say, I'd like to do a PhD in this topic, what's the one emergent theme or topic that's come from both books you'd like that PhD student to go away and delve into and do some deep research?
Oof, that's a good question. It probably would be autoethnographies or ethnography. You could probably do a PhD and interview other men on their experiences. We've actually continued, because when we finished that Femininities book, we felt like, and quite a few women actually came forward and said, listen, it's great, but we don't really want to have a chapter published. We don't want to have our names in it. So we actually continued and interviewed more women anonymously, because more things came out. So maybe something like this as well, because not everyone is prepared to write a chapter or be, really open about it. So maybe a PhD about actually finding out from other men different levels, different research fields on their experiences and their thoughts. And there might be actually more revealing things coming out that you don't necessarily reflect with your name on in a chapter.
Okay. Any questions? Anything else?
Since I've still got the box, I'll get a question. In the past, there's been a lot of emphasis on advancing research through doing multidisciplinary research. To what extent is there a way forward in terms of doing multi-gendered research, where you have two or more different genders working on the same topic and integrated from the start? I
think it would be brilliant. I think that would get around a lot of issues. Absolutely agree. From our Femininities book, we actually found particularly, women who my age or with children, they get instant access to communities. It's much easier for women to talk to other women, particularly if they have a baby in tow or are married or things like this. So yes, so we probably have to think much harder about that, how to actually get access. So I reflected on Joseph Cheer, who did research in Vanuatu. It probably would have helped a lot if there was a female researcher who maybe then actually would have been able to talk to the women in the in the village. And I also know from my colleague Porter, who did research in the Philippines, and she reflected in a chapter that once she had a baby, she did research in the Philippines in a very remote fishing village. As soon as she had a baby, she had a very, very different access to the people living in the village, to the women, but also to the men. She was no longer a threat. She's got a baby, and other women can relate to that. So yeah, it's a very good question. maybe I think, and that's probably something that came through as our Femininities book as well, very much, that idea of actually sending one researcher out into the field probably needs to be questioned. I mean, for women, quite often it's for safety issues, but in general, actually, maybe it would be much better, different gender research groups. They have different skills, different advantages and disadvantages. So yeah, very good question. But it also gets away from that lone researcher, and that's the original narrative of the lone researcher doing objective research. And I think both these books prove that, well, that's actually not the case, because all research is subjective.
Okay, any more final questions? Opportunity? Any questions online? I think got just another ha-ha from Amelia. Oh, we've got, sorry, another question has come through, sorry. Another question from Dennis Tolka. T-O-L-K.
Oh, yeah. I know him.
Yeah.
Yep, hello.
His question is, all contributors seem rather progressive. Did you try to find a contributor who would represent toxic masculinity?
Good question. Probably not.
It's a reality TV show.
Yeah, I mean, you see, this is where it would be interesting to do a PhD, because I doubt they would have volunteered to contribute. Correct?
They would struggle with the reflection itself.
Yeah, like I said, Mark Oram struggled, and he would be probably progressive, but he's still so yeah. Good question, Dennis. Yes. Do you want to volunteer?
What's a question to Dennis? Okay, that's been brilliant. We've got about five minutes. What were the emergent? How are the emergent themes different from the book you did here with the book you did on femininity in the field?
Oh, it's very different, very different. Like I said, for the women, not once reflected. Women don't reflect on being female. Every chapter, to some extent, reflected on what it means to be a man. So obviously, there is a big question mark there. Yeah. So for women was always about dealing with sexual harassment or taking care of themselves or having children with them. So it was always outside of them and how to, deal with that.
So
or excess conduct, the way you dress, and all of that. Whereas all the men reflected on what it means to be a man and what masculinities means, but also actually very much, no, I'm not toxic masculinity. No, that's not me. So distancing themselves from that as well.
Okay.
And I think that seems to be quite, like I said, I mean, that's sort of happening in New Zealand now as well, isn't it? The He'll Be Right. And there's other movements, men's sheds, getting them to talk about emotions and revealing. So we do have an issue here in New Zealand as well. So our book actually starts with Jack Shepard's, and that's a great chapter, Boys Do Not Cry. So if you want to read one thing, and I think that's what, it opens a whole Pandora's box of, yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. So if there's no more questions, just one final plug. What was the discount code?
Oh, hang on. MITF 40. Or they can contact me and I send them the link.
Brilliant. That's absolutely
yes.
fantastic.
So Channel View, thank you. Yes. So until the end of July, 40% discount, MITF 40.
Okay. So everybody's got that across the world, on the globe.
And yes, if you want to.
This webinar has been recorded, so it'll be put on Victoria University's website and it'll go onto YouTube and that type of thing. So it'll be there for as a permanent record. But Heike, absolutely brilliant. And I just remember you 10 years ago as a wee PhD student graduated, and we decided one day, let's write a book.
Yes.
And it just happened.
I know.
On family tourism. And you've gone on from there in terms of progression, academic discipline, and establishing yourself as a great associate professor up at AUT. So thank you. Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, so thank you, Ian, and thank you, Victoria University, and thank you for coming, and thank you for attending in the webinar. So I'm very honoured.
Thank you. The next hybrid seminar will be on the 31st of August with Professor Kathleen Schuff from Thompson Rivers University, and John Allen, the CEO of Wellington NZ, and they'll be talking about creative tourism in small places. So it's all about smallness and creativity in terms of placemaking. So that'll be on the 31st of August, and that'll be advertised on the web towards